when so many Republicans suddenly became the world's most passionate defenders of patients with pre-existing conditions. They told voters that never, ever could they even imagine doing anything that would weaken the protections that stop health insurance companies from discriminating against people with pre-existing conditions, whether they be breast cancer survivors or children born with birth defects, or any of the tens of millions of Americans who manage chronic conditions like diabetes or depression or high blood pressure. Well, Americans are about to find out whether my Republican colleagues meant a word of what they said on the campaign trail. Americans will soon see whether Republicans stand up for patients with pre-existing conditions or vote to confirm Chad Readler to the Ohio Sixth Circuit Court. This nominee's record of threatening patients with pre-existing conditions is not up for debate. Chad Readler was the mastermind behind the Trump administration's effort to strip away the core of the Affordable Care Act, the principle that health insurance companies cannot deny coverage or kick a patient off their policy just because of their medical history. On the campaign trail, President Trump spoke of protecting Americans with pre-existing conditions. But we now know that was just another lie. Apparently, it wasn't enough for this administration to stop defending the Affordable Care Act in court. The president sought to attack it in court. Initially, the Trump administration struggled to find someone at the Department of Justice willing to take on this cause. In fact, 3 separate career attorneys at the Justice Department refused to argue the administration's position in court. One employee even resigned. But Chad Readler, the nominee we're voting on today, he was more than happy to take on this cruel and unjust cause. He became the chief architect of the Trump administration's legal brief, challenging the very constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act's protections for people with pre-existing conditions. In other words, Chad Readler's legal brief took the administration's effort to sabotage the Affordable Care Act to a whole new level, threatening to bring us back to a time when health insurance companies didn't have to cover cancer survivors, or individuals with substance abuse disorder, or anyone who has ever confronted a health challenge in their lives. And how did President Trump reward Chad Readler for leading this assault on patients and their families? Well, the day after he filed this reckless and morally repugnant legal brief, the president nominated him to serve on the Sixth Circuit. Now, let me tell you, Mr. President, I spent a lot of time crisscrossing New Jersey over the past year, and I don't think I met a single constituent who came up to me and said, "Senator, what my family really needs you to do is once again let health insurance companies deny us care." On the contrary, I heard from and continue to hear from New Jerseyans who depend on these protections. They can't even believe that this is still even an issue. Last summer, I spoke with a woman from Highland Park named Ann Vardaman, who told me she was diagnosed with PTSD after surviving a sexual assault. Ann told me that health insurers shouldn't be able to, quote, charge me more for something that is a horrible thing that happens to millions of people in this country through absolutely no fault of their own. Indeed, without the Affordable Care Act, there would be no federal health protections for survivors of sexual violence like her. Perhaps one of my constituents, Ann Zavalek of Middlesex, New Jersey, said it best when she wrote about her battle against bladder cancer. She wrote to me, "It is crucial that I continue to receive scans to make sure there is no reoccurrence of the cancer. If I don't have coverage for pre-existing conditions, I'll go bankrupt, and then I'll probably die. So yeah, this is kind of super important to me personally." Mr. President, it should be personal to all of us. Everyone in this body should take it personally when this administration attacks protections that 130 million Americans rely on for their health and financial security. People remember what it was like before the Affordable Care Act, and they don't want to go backwards. They remember how women could be denied coverage for maternity care or charge higher premiums simply for being a woman. Today, being a woman is no longer a pre-existing condition. They remember how infants born with heart deformities could hit lifetime caps within days of being born. Today, families don't have to worry about lifetime caps. They remember how cancer survivors and Americans with chronic conditions like diabetes or asthma lived in fear of being denied coverage or dropped from their policies at a moment's notice. Today, patients are protected from discrimination, but they will not be if the courts side with Chad Readler's shameful arguments on behalf of this administration. This issue is personal for millions of Americans across our country, from 3.8 million in New Jersey to 4.3 million in Georgia to 4.8 million in Ohio, Mr. Readler's home state. All told, 130 million Americans with pre-existing conditions may suffer the consequences of Mr. Readler's assault on the Affordable Care Act. These Americans are not Democrats or Republicans or independents. They're human beings with a right to access affordable, quality health care. Does this Senate really want to reward someone largely responsible for endangering the coverage our constituents depend on with a lifetime appointment to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals? I sure hope not. That's not the kind of judgment we want on any court. Last fall, we heard a lot of talk from Republicans about protecting people with pre-existing conditions. But we know that actions speak louder than words. And it is action that we need right now. We need every member of this body to stand up for the right of all Americans to get quality health care coverage. We need every member of this body to stand up for the proposition that Americans cannot be discriminated against in their health care coverage because of a pre-existing condition. And we need every member of this body to vote against the nomination of Chad Readler for the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. With that, Mr. President, I yield back and observe the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.